Hello and welcome to Hesson's County. I'm glad that you could join us again today for another TTRPG Talk. This series takes a look at tabletop role-playing games and related materials, makes some suggestions for your own games, and takes a look at some of my own materials. Today we're going to be continuing our SRD series with an SRD that is very near and dear to my heart, and is actually the first one that I ever used, and that would be the Carta system. For those of you who don't know, the Carta system was originally created by Cat McDonald of Peach Garden Games and is therefore distributed by Peach Garden Games. One thing that is important to go ahead and note right now, since I usually do so, is the SRD was released under the Creative Commons Attribution license, the 3.0 license. So, of course, you can use this to create your own commercial products, should you wish, as long as you, of course, credit Cat McDonald and Peach Garden Games in your legal language at the beginning of your game or whatever. So, let's take a look at this SRD. Now, the SRD for Carta is really designed for exploration-focused games. What exactly you're exploring, that can be lots of different things. As you can probably tell from the name, Carta is, of course, maps. So quite often, a lot of the games developed using the Carta system involve some sort of mapping, whether that's mapping through time, space, internally. There's lots of different ways that you could do it. The basics of a Carta game is that you have a standard deck of playing cards, just 52 card playing deck, and then you pull out of your deck. Normally it's 24 cards. You will have one card be set as like your finish card and one card be set as your start card, and then you have 22 cards in between that are arranged out in your 4x6 grid. The basic idea is that you are starting on your starting point and you're trying to find your finish point while you're moving around on this board of shuffled cards. Again, everything is laid out face down, so you can't see them until your character moves and lands on it and therefore flips it over. Each of those flipped cards connects to a prompt that usually is related to a card, is attached to a particular event in a sort of like an oracle that decides exactly what is happening on that location. A good example of this is in my game, in my pure Carta game, The Land and the People. Each of the items is an event that is happening as your team, who are trying to draw a map, are moving around. So the card tells you what kind of thing you're finding there, and then also gives you that you would actually like add to a physical map. But it also tells you a specific event that is occurring to your team of cartographers that makes your continuing a journey either easier or more difficult. Speaking of which, the way that you kind of make a Carta game more complicated is by integrating different types of resources. Normally, these resources either take the form of a survival mode or they take the form of a collection mode. Normally in a survival mode of Carta, you start the game with a certain number of resources. Moving around deducts from your pool of resources, and certain events in the cards will either give you extra resources or time, right? Or they'll remove them. The consequence, usually there is some sort of consequence when you hit 0. In some Carta games, it might be your character dies, or you run, or again, going back to the example that I have of The Land and the People, if your resources hit 0, which I literally called time, if your survival resources hits 0, then you have to move back to the beginning square, and some of the cards that had been previously put out end up getting covered over by new cards. So it makes it more difficult for you to potentially find your ending point. A second element that you can add to a Carta game that makes it more complicated is a collection mode. In this version, basically you're moving around with the idea that certain events basically give you resources, whatever resource you're collecting, to eventually reach your end goal, where you have to have a certain number at the end of the game. A good example of this is I cannot remember the name of it off the top of my head, so I will put it somewhere on the screen here. But there is a version of a Carta game where you're basically playing a probe, an interstellar probe that's running around on this planet trying to find some more information. Of course, you're collecting data that you then would send back to the humans or aliens or whoever sent you to this planet. Right. In some of the games that enter a collection mode, sometimes you're just gathering information, but in other ones, like in The Land and the People, there are actually times when you might lose it. Maybe like let's say in that probe droid game, right? Let's say you end up, some of your data gets corrupted, right? In The Land and the People, some of the information that you collected earlier might turn out to be wrong, right? Or it might turn out that things have changed since you collected that information and now it's not accurate anymore. Stuff like that. Normally, as I mentioned, there's usually a goal card. That is the final card that you end the game on that you're trying to find. If you're integrating a survival and collection and a goal card all together in the same game, normally what you're trying to do is you're trying to collect a certain amount of this collection resource and find the goal card before you run out of your survival resource. Or at the very least, the survival resource makes you reset, essentially. Again, as I mentioned, you can, of course, tweak any of these different sort of setups, either adding or removing any of those three elements, the collection of the goal, making the map bigger or small, making the sort of Carta board bigger or smaller. Cat McDonald, they do provide some examples and statistics that would make it easier for you to potentially tweak, either making the game easier or harder, adding more cards and so on. Finally, again, as I mentioned, each of the cards has a prompt that goes with it. Usually this is some sort of an event or an item in a location, or maybe a specific thing in time. A good example of this is, again, I'm sorry, I'm not remembering the name of it. I should have looked these up earlier. But there's one where you basically, you're role-playing a person who is having tea with a friend. As you're moving around the Carta board, you're drinking different kinds of tea, and you're basically role-playing out or sketching out in your head, journaling out how that event would basically go, how the conversation would form, not only around this specific tea, but also a topic that your conversation is going to be about. And in that particular case, there isn't really a resource you're collecting or anything. It's just role-playing out until finally you hit the cup of coffee, which is your end card, and then that's the end of the game. Cat McDonald did also provide here a list of different types of items, like prompts or like topics that you might want each of your suits to kind of cover, that make doing this, setting this up a little bit easier for someone who maybe has never done something like this before, especially since, again, because you have 52 different cards, you're going to need to write out 52 different prompts, or depending upon the mechanics of your game, potentially even more. So, for example, there is one version of this game called La Bête, which I'm probably pronouncing wrong because I'm pretty sure it's French, where you're actually playing some sort of monster of the night who spends part of your life as like a regular, looking and acting and appearing to be like a normal human, but you spend the other part of your life actually in some sort of bestial form. And so there's actually two different Carta boards, and each Carta board has its own set of prompts. One being when you're moving around as a human being, and the other being when you're moving around as a monster. That each have very different sets of flavors and have like at least eight different, potential endings and, stuff like that. So there was a lot put into writing that one. One thing that's really nice, at least in my experience, when it comes to using Carta, is that it is not only really useful as the basis for a game by itself, but it's also really useful as a mechanic to go alongside other games. So, for example, in again taking a look at one of my own games, Run Villain Run was a game that I created where the basic idea is you're leaving your village behind. You're you're a villain. You're a peasant, and you're fleeing your feudal village, and you're trying to reach a free city. Where if you manage to get to the city and you hide for a while, then basically your liege lord, right? Your whoever basically essentially owns your bondage can't come and take you back. But you have to get there first, of course. So the basic idea of the game is just you're trying to get from your village to this city without like getting caught or getting hurt or losing so much food and stuff that you just have to give up, right? So again, there's multiple survival resources in that game, and each of the cards as you're moving from one location to another gives you an event, a prompt. But in this multiplayer game, each of those events you actually role play out using the Caltrop core system. And then when you're done with that, your team moves, your team moves on to the next card as you're trying to make your way to the free city. So, like I mentioned, Carta is incredibly useful as a tool, not only for standalone games, but also for structures, mechanics that could be incorporated into another system to kind of help with world building or basically no prep adventure guidance to really help whoever the game master is essentially develop the story, or being really useful for games that do not incorporate a game master in them. So definitely something to check out. Links, as always, of course, to the SRD can be found in the doobly-doo down below, along with links to all the games that I mentioned today, including the ones I couldn't remember the names for. I apologize. And yeah, definitely check this out. As I mentioned, this is an SRD that was really fundamental in me kind of getting back into writing role-playing games after being gone for quite a long time. So definitely check it out. And don't forget to rate your itch purchases either. Have a good time. If you would like to show your support for this channel or for the Hessens County blog, in the description down below, you will find links to the channel coffee and also the itch store. Please feel free to take a look, and thank you for your support.